Hello, YouTube. My name is Alan, and it's that time once again. Let's talk metal. For this episode, I'm going to talk a bit about the effect of nostalgia and how it sort of influences things that we really get into, how we don't. Some of this is probably pretty obvious, but it's something I've been thinking about lately, and yeah, just kind of wanted to talk through it. And figured, sure, I'll subject all of you to my inner dialogue here. Um, One band in particular that kind of, I circle back to from time to time that I've never really gotten is Voivod. And Voivod is widely heralded as one of the most innovative, important, influential heavy metal bands of all time. And I've never established much of a connection with them whatsoever. This is the only Voivod CD I own at this point. I found it at a used bookstore, picked it up to give them another chance. I come back to them every few years and play a few albums here, play a few albums there. And a lot of them I think, yep, that's pretty good. Hey, this one's kind of cool. There are some that I haven't enjoyed that much. I'm like, yeah, I don't think this era of the band maybe is for me. But, others like, Dimension Hatros, Killing Technology, I'm like, yeah, okay, these are pretty interesting, kind of cool albums. But I never develop a really deep connection with them. And on one hand, it's easy to say that, oh, I'm messing out, or oh, I just don't get it, because everybody else seems to. People are like, oh, how can you not love that band? Like, well, I don't know. Why don't I love that band? Why am I not as into Voivod as everyone else? Part of it could be that, yeah, the style is just different and doesn't click with me. There are some things about Voivod at times that I don't fully enjoy. I'm not a huge fan of the more robotic kind of vocal style that's used on some of the early stuff. I'm not always a big fan of those kind of very bent and angular sounding riffs. Those are a little harder on my ears. It takes me a little longer to figure out what's going on. So, yeah, there are elements of Voivod's music that may not quite be for me. But another thing that's occurred to me is that, even if I did like Voivod, even if I play this today and, the clouds part and the angels sing and all of a sudden I get it, even if all that comes true and I immediately then fall in love and think, oh yeah, fantastic band, I've seen the light, I've got it, and now I dig in and enjoy it, I'm still never going to enjoy it as much as you do. If you are a long-term dedicated Voivod fan, and there are lots of them out there, Jeff Wagner, Marty over at Heavy Metallurgy, Jurgen, I'm never going to like Voivod nearly as much as any of those guys. And it's not because of anything in the music. It's not going to be because of the vocals or the bent angular riffs or any chord shapes that I have trouble digesting. It's going to be because I will never have the nostalgic connection to that band that other people do. You know, again, even if I fall in love with them today and start playing them a ton, this album is never going to be connected to my early days of hearing heavy metal. It's not something I ever listened to with friends in the high school parking lot or driving around, going, hoping to find records at a record store. It was not something I was playing on my Walkman in study hall. I will never have that connection with this album. And that is a big part of our connection to the music that we really love. It's not, the sole contributing thing. I'm not saying it's the only reason people like Voivod is because, oh, well, you got to hear it as a teenager. But that definitely, I think, adds a multiplier to their enjoyment of it today. It's something they can still hear and enjoy and appreciate for all the musical nuances going on. But that gets exacerbated because it's also something that they had all those happy memories and experiences with, things that we look back now on very fondly from our middle age and feel like, yes, this was part of the soundtrack of, my salad days. That, yeah, I remember hearing this album on my first date or at a first dance or at the party back at, Jimmy's Place, when his parents were out of town, blah, 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 all that kind of stuff. All of that plays a role in how much we appreciate albums later on in life. And I can never have that level of appreciation or connection with Voivod because it wasn't present in my life at that time. Compare that to something like, Halloween, Keepers Part 1. Yes, I talk about this album a lot. It's my favorite heavy metal album of all time. And a big part of the reason for that is because I have been listening to it for somewhere on the order of 34 years at the time of this making, and it still holds up great. And I can talk about it song by song and why I like, the guitar solos the way they are and Michael Kiska's vocals and etc. But yes, the nostalgia factor amplifies all of that. You know, this album, just to get a copy of it, I had to wait a few months until the high school band went on a field trip to a city with a bigger record store that had a copy I could buy. And I sat in the hotel room that whole weekend, with headphones on, intently listening to every line of it while friends, like, Charlie are sitting at the table next to me, smoking and playing poker and just like, hey, you want in on this? I'm just like, can't play, listening. It's all those memories are part of why I love this album so much. It's not just the great songs and musicianship and all that. It's also because it's part of my memory and memories that are fun, from a time that, yeah, it feels very enjoyable. When you get into middle age, if you're watching this and it doesn't make sense, congratulations, you're probably not middle aged yet. It will happen to you too. You get to a certain point in life and you realize that, yeah, a lot of those days when at the time they may have felt like teenage struggles and sucks being in school and can't do anything fun because of my parents and all that. You look back and realize that you had a lot more time and a lot more freedom and choices to do things, and you had to spend a lot more time with albums. And they were the albums that really helped kind of cement what your musical tastes were moving forward. Sure, they may have changed and grown and expanded over time, but you trace all your musical roots back to those first early defining albums. Yeah, I can never trace Voivod back to that. Even if I get into Voivod today, it's at a time when I own something like over 5,000 different albums. They're part of a big collective. This is the first German power speed metal album I ever heard. And as such, it had a much bigger influence and impact on my life. And so, you know, I'm always going to rank this album higher than this album. Even if we sit here and pick them apart and prove that this one is absolutely riff for riff, you know, note for note superior from technical standpoints and all that, it doesn't matter because nostalgia gets those extra votes and puts the other one ahead for me. So yeah, it's just been interesting thinking about, for example, when we've recently done things like our top 5 metal albums of all time on heavy metallurgy. We did that episode a couple of months ago, as of the time of this recording, with S. Craig Zoller and Melanie. And yeah, when I look at all the contenders that were on the list, they're all albums I've known for ages. There's nothing that's popped up in the past 10 years or 20 years that was, even a thought that it should be in those like top 5 albums. It was all very formative kinds of things that I had known forever. And I think, off the top of my head, I don't remember everything that everybody picked, but I think it was that way for all 4 of us that did that live stream together, that we were picking lots of albums that, yeah, they were a big part of our growing up, that we have lots of nostalgia for. I pulled a few others just as, other examples of things that I do or don't have a maybe magnified connection with because of that nostalgia factor. For whatever reason, back in the day, Creator never really crossed my path much. I'd hear a song on a compilation here and there, but I guess I just didn't like the tracks enough to want to follow up and buy an album by them the next time I had a chance to. So I was really late to check out Creator's discography. I have found some albums I really love. Pleasure to Kill. This is a banger of an album. It is nasty, vicious thrashing, but good sense of melody still woven into all this, hatred that's spewing forth. It took a few spins, but yeah, when this album clicked, it clicked hard, and I think it is absolutely fantastic now. But is it ever really going to make like, my, top 10 thrash metal albums of all time kind of list? It's going to be really hard for it to do that because to me, this album is like 3 or 4 years old. That's all the history I have with it. So how is that going to measure up against, a lot of like Testament or Overkill or Early Destruction albums, albums that I've got 25, 30 years of connection with? This probably, even though this was a contemporary of those albums and came out at the same time as those albums, this one's going to have trouble ever supplanting those in my head and in my list simply because I haven't had as long-term connection and relationship with this album, even though I do love it a lot. I've played it a lot more than any, Overkill or Testament type albums in recent years because it's new and it's exciting and I like it a lot. But if I had to sit down and write out the list, I don't know if this would make it. Maybe it should, but it doesn't have that long-term factor to it. Here's one that maybe I overrate a little bit due to nostalgia. It is Bolt Thrower's War Master. I like pretty much all of Bolt Thrower's catalog. Maybe the Mercenary album I could do without, but for the most part, very consistent, good stuff. Most people don't rank this one very high. For a long time, my knee-jerk reaction was always that it was my favorite Bolt Thrower album. I wouldn't say that today, but it's taken a while to kind of talk this one down off the top of the tree, get it down to maybe where I feel like it belongs now, a little more in the middle of the pack. Why did I have this one ranked as my favorite for such a long time? Because it was the first one I heard. This was my introduction to Bolt Thrower. And yes, great memories of driving around, with Matt, my buddy from college, with him, playing this. We listened to it for a good chunk of the way going to and driving back from a big paleontology conference in Pittsburgh ages ago. We listened to it a ton when we were both out doing geologic mapping stuff in Colorado and New Mexico a year or two later. Um, it does have my favorite Bolt Thrower song on it. That doesn't hurt Badgers any. The track is Cenotaph, of course. But, yeah, sitting down and working back through the Bolt Thrower catalog, it's like there are other albums I played a lot more, like the debut. And there are other albums that, yeah, just song for song are better overall. Fourth Crusade, for example. There's nothing wrong with War Master at the end of the day, and I still like the album a lot. But what got it so high up in the rankings when I've now have moved it down? Well, a big part of it was just all those memories of like, yeah, this was, so awesome, just blowing my mind hearing this, massive tank tread crushing sound for the first time on that big road trip to Pittsburgh back and forth. That kind of thing, it probably shouldn't be part of how we're ranking albums or grading albums or stuff like that, but it does. It very much colors our perceptions that way. And so, yeah, this one was always higher up the list probably than it should have been. Another album that has that effect with me is this one, Iron Maiden's Live After Death. I had this among my top five favorite heavy metal albums of all time. I may have played this album more than any other heavy metal album. I don't know for sure. This one would certainly be in contention for album I have played the most in my life. Most people would not think of this as their favorite heavy metal album or even their favorite Iron Maiden album. It's like, wait, what? The live album? Why? This was not my introduction to Iron Maiden, to be clear. I had gotten at least some Iron Maiden stuff before this. I honestly don't remember the order I got introduced to different Iron Maiden stuff. I know the first thing I ever heard was the Live in Japan EP because I bought it on a used cassette in Atlanta. Oh, probably the summer. It was either the summer. of 89 or 90. Probably the summer of 90. Um, but may have been the summer of 89. That was my introduction to Maiden. So it was Paul Di'Anno era Maiden. After that, I'm not sure. I know I heard the first two albums, the self-titled and Killers early on. I heard No Prayer for the Dying pretty early on because that was like one of the newer, more recent albums at the time that was getting released. But I did hear this one pretty early too. This one, the big nostalgia connection for me on this one is that this was my introduction to a lot of these classics from the early Bruce Dickinson years. That I definitely had this before I had Number of the Beast, or before I had Power Slave, or before I had Peace of Mind. This definitely came before those three albums. So yes, my introduction to lots of those songs, Rhyme of the Ancient Mariner, Aces High, 2 Minutes to Midnight, Hallowed Be My Name. This was my introduction to a lot of those essential Iron Maiden songs. So I knew these versions by heart before I picked up all the individual studio albums for Maiden. Again, I had some, but I don't think I had any of those classic Bruce albums. At most, I had the two Di'Anno albums, so I knew those songs. But Here and I'm Here by Bruce, a little different, of course. And No Prayer for the Dying, of course, came along after this, so that didn't really affect the track list when they did this. So yeah, that's why this album ranks so high with me. Lots and lots of spins. This has always been one of those go-to albums, like when I've moved, and I've moved a lot of times. That when I am especially unpacking things, I'm like, okay, I've got hours of unpacking boxes here. What do I want to listen to? I just want to listen to something fun and familiar. This becomes one of my big unpacking albums. It's long. I can put it in, let it play for a long time. Enjoy it. It's peppy, upbeat, keeps me going, working through stuff. I don't need to stop and listen to it in detail because I know it in detail. So it works perfect for that kind of thing. But yeah, I get when most other people would not have this ranked great. When you stop and nitpick it, okay, it's probably not the greatest live album of all time. Bruce's vocals not his strongest necessarily. I get that. But the nostalgia vote outweighs that in my head. So this still gets ranked really high, even though I know it has its flaws. Look at one final example, and then we'll wrap this up. All right. Um, what about Morbid Angels, Blessed Are the Sick? This is one of my favorite death metal albums. I'm sure sooner or later on Metallurgy we'll do our favorite death metal albums. I don't know where this one's going to fall on the list, but it's probably going to be on the list. This is one I heard relatively early on, kind of early stages of getting introduced to death metal. But then I got really just burned out on death metal in total pretty fast by 93, 94-ish for sure. Just like got very tired of it. It was extremely popular in the area I lived in, but it was just kind of the same few bands. I got tired of hearing, five or six Cannibal Corpse songs on college radio on the metal show when they would play it. It's like, can you guys mix it up a little bit more? Yeah, the style got stale for me, as it did for a lot of people by, the 94 or so. So there was a long time where I just didn't play anything like Blessed Are the Sick. When I started, coming back around to death metal a little bit more years later, so I was like, yeah, this was one of the first things I got a copy of. And I was like, oh yeah, I think that's a good album. Oh, I liked that, didn't I? Got it in a tape trade from somebody and just like, oh yeah, yep, that's still that still sounds really good. So this one, there's kind of a weird gap. There's some nostalgic connection because it was an early foray into death metal, but then it kind of got interrupted. And as such, I don't have as much of a nostalgic connection to like this as I do the Bolt Thrower, even though I didn't hear the Bolt Thrower until several years after first hearing Blessed Are the Sick. So how do like those two line up in my head? This is the better album, and if I can objectively rank them, this would be a lot higher than War Master. But knee-jerk reaction can sometimes still be like, yeah, oh yeah, yeah, War Master, fantastic. And Morbid Angel, yeah, there was a period where I didn't listen to that one much, but it's because I wasn't listening to any death metal much. This is also the reason that no death metal albums made it onto my five favorite albums of all time list. When I put that list together, there were no death metal titles in contention. Even though there's a lot of death metal albums I really like, none of them quite got up there at the level where they were going to compete with the albums that I did choose as my five favorites. And part of it is the nostalgia vote doesn't quite come into play as strongly on these. Again, there's that phase by the mid and late 90s where I wasn't into death metal. And even for the phase where I was a little bit earlier in the 90s, a lot of these I started having to check out more like on my own. Uh, Not a lot of memories of checking out stuff like Morbid Angel or Death of Obituary with friends in high school and hanging out and all that kind of stuff. It was a lot more like college radio getting introduced to them. It kind of crossed over. There was a few things that made it into my high school, but again, it was a small rural high school. There weren't many kids interested in this kind of stuff. We checked out Carcass. I picked up a Napalm Death cassette and introduced folks to Napalm Death. But it was kind of, we only heard a few things here and there. So when I think about like, yeah, checking out a lot of death metal for the first time, it's like, well, it was dubbing songs off of college radio, sitting in a dorm room at Saturday night at 2 a.m. in the morning, which I kind of have a fond memory of. But at the same time, it's like it's not quite the same when you're sitting there checking it out yourself as when you were checking it out in the cafeteria with all your buddies. I didn't find anybody into this stuff early in my college years. So, as I made my trips to the record store myself. I picked up whatever albums interested me and played them myself. There wasn't a group of people right away at college where I was getting, to have that kind of experience, something that would provide that amplifying nostalgic factor to make me think, oh yeah, we used to sit around all the time drinking beer and listening to this together. It's like, nope, nope. It was dubbing songs off of college radio and hoping I could find a copy of it in the used bin the next time I walked downtown to the record store on my own. So yeah, as such, this album has some nostalgia value for me, but not as much as the others. And that's kind of an issue for that one and why it doesn't maybe rank as high as some of the others. So I think I've said my piece here. You know, again, some of it's kind of self-evident, I suppose, that yes, we're going to have a strong connection to the albums from our early years of getting into a scene. But it's occurred to me more and more that, yeah, it probably really does have a stronger influence than we realize when it comes to shaping the albums we really love the most. Whether those albums are objectively good or not is, yeah, can't even say if they're objectively good. But that nostalgia vote, having that box checked for a record or a movie, and it probably applies to, other things in life too, a TV show or a toy, whatever. Those things that we have those strong early connections to always are going to get, elevated over some things that we just didn't get exposed to, got exposed to later on, or just for, oddball reasons, just didn't quite get the full check mark in that nostalgia box. So let's now talk metal in the comments down below. Is there something more to this? Am I just stating the obvious? Are there albums you feel like, yeah, I probably overvalue those to a certain extent, but it's because I have such a strong connection to them in terms of growing up with them? And are there certain albums that you feel like, yeah, I never quite got into this band or that band either, or even though they may be kind of good, but I just don't have that connection. Um, or I established that connection too late to really ever put them up on that same, S tier pantheon of my personal rankings. Let me know which albums have affected you that way, which bands. And until next time, as always, please take care. And as always, keep banging your head.